Hi everyone, welcome back to Goodnight Stories. My name is Lyra, and I will be your guide into whatever book we decide to read tonight. From young readers to young adult novels, my hope is to give you a comfortable space to listen to a story. So, sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea. Tonight we jump back into Kathryn Lasky's The Rescue, the third book in the Guardians of Ga'Hoole series. Sorry, I fixed this book earlier with some book tape because this is a really old book of mine. I've had it since I was like 8 or 9, and the cover is falling apart. I'm trying to just flatten that piece right now. Anyway. Chapter 13. Octavia Speaks. Yes, my dear, the ribe was added after we arrived here, and the owls knew that the greatest of scholars and warriors had come to the great Ga'Hoole tree. She paused. You know him as Easelribe. At that moment, Digger entered the secret chamber. He was frantic. I called trying to warn you. I tried everything to distract her. I'm really sorry. Octavia swung her head toward the burrowing owl. Don't worry. For a long time I've felt that Soren was up to something. Since that first night of the harvest festivities. I would have found out sooner or later. Soren remembered now how Octavia had slithered out onto the gallery to help Madame Plonk, who had passed out from the milkberry wine. Everyone else had been distracted by the comet's appearance. It was the perfect distraction, camouflage for their leaving. But just as Soren was sweeping from the great hollow, he had felt the gaze of the sightless snake boring into him. She did have extraordinary powers, even if she had not been born blind. You won't tell anybody, will you, Octavia? There was almost a pleading tone in Soren's voice. No. What good would that do? It wouldn't help get Easelribe back. Do you think that his disappearance has something to do with his past? With someone who wants to get even? Octavia coiled up and extended her head directly toward Soren. He had that same feeling again, as if her gaze were penetrating his deepest thoughts. Who told you that? The roguesmith of Silvervale. Octavia lifted her head slightly. Yes, I might have known. She's quite different from her sister, isn't she? It was useless asking the snake how she knew anything. She just seemed to know. But how come she doesn't know where Easelribe is? Soren asked himself. Now Octavia picked up her feather duster and began whisking the film of dust off a stack of books on a desk near the claws. Gylfie gave a little sneeze. Allergies. Don't worry. Go ahead, Octavia. The place is a mess, isn't it? It's hard for me to come in here and tidy up. Too many memories. Of course, Soren said softly, but he had a feeling that Octavia was about to recount some of those memories, and perhaps moving about, keeping busy with this simple task of dusting, would loosen her forked tongue. You see, young'uns, Octavia began, as she kneaded the stack of papers and continued dusting Easelribe's desk. Easelribe and I go way back. Back to the time when he was known as Lize, the almost legendary warrior of the War of the Ice Claws. The 3 young owls hardly dared to breathe as the chubby old snake began her tale. This War of the Ice Claws was the longest in history. It was well into its 2nd century by the time Lize was hatched. He was groomed, trained, raised to be a warrior, as were all the young owls from the Stormfast Isle in the Bay of Kiel, in the Everwinter Sea. His father, his mother, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents were all superb soldiers. Every single one of them had been a commander of an air artillery division. They were learned too, knew how to fight with their minds, not just their talons. But it was soon apparent, as soon as Lize first fledged and took to the wing, that this was one extraordinary young whiskered screech owl, more brilliant than any of his siblings, which was later to cause trouble in the nest. He soon became the youngest commander of of an air artillery division, and shortly thereafter began in earnest to train colliers. Now, you were probably wondering where I came in. Well, on the island of Stormfast there were, of course, nest-made snakes. They were blind, but there was another breed of snake called Keelians, and they were not blind. They didn't have rosy scales, but the blue-green ones like my own. I am a Keelian snake. We are known for our industry and wit, more muscular than the blind snakes, and extremely supple. Octavia paused for a moment. That isn't all fat, you know. She twisted her head about and patted her body with it. Lots of muscle there. In any case, we could go into places that were unreachable to blind snakes, and because of our musculature, we could actually dig holes, be it on the ground or in a tree. Yes, our fangs were as effective as a woodpecker's beak. The three owls froze as two long fangs shot from her mouth. Scary, aren't they? She paused to give the owls another look, then continued with her story. It was Lies who first thought of using us in battle. Lies and I were about the same age. My parents knew his parents, but there really wasn't much mingling between snakes and owls in general in Stormfast. You have to understand that creatures who live in the Everwinter Sea and along its coast aren't really sociable types. They stick to themselves. It's such a harsh environment that does not lend itself to, how should I put it, frivolry, except for yours truly here. I was a problem snake, a problem as a young'un, and it only grew worse as I grew older. I loved fooling about, having fun, getting into trouble, but I don't mind telling you I was a terrible flirt in those days. It seems the whole industry thing for which our species was known had just passed me by. I can remember my mum saying once that if she didn't know better, she'd think she and Pa were raising a chipmunk. Chipmunks are silly, incredibly irresponsible, frivolous creatures. I was driving my parents to distraction by the time I was a teenager. It was just around that time that Lies came up with the idea to train Keelian snakes for battle. One day, when Lies was flying over the rocky crag where my parents had their nest, one of the few sunny days, and I was out sunning myself, doing nothing, and my mom was ranting at me, Lies heard her from above. He had just had the idea for a stealth forth of Keelian snakes. He lighted down and said to my mom, "Give her to me, ma'am, and she'll never have another lazy day in her life. I'll turn her into a crack soldier." I, of course, was horrified by the idea. But before I knew what had happened, Mum and Pa had nodded their consent, and I was in Liza's talents being flown off to a training camp. The only compensation was that there were some handsome male Keelians, but my goodness, after a day's training, I wasn't fit for anything but sleep. Well, you might not believe it, but I turned into a pretty fair soldier for the stealth force. I think it was Lies who made me. To tell you the truth, that owl could inspire anyone. Soren felt a twinge in his gizzard. How true it is, he thought, and he remembered his times flying with Iselrib through forest fires, gales, and the worst of storms. Lies took a mate shortly after I came into training. In a sense, that was when his troubles with his brother really began. His brother, a seemingly quiet, gentle owl named Ifgar, had fancied Liza's mate, but she did not fancy him. The War of the Ice Claws was getting fiercer. The League of Kiel, for it was the isles of the Bay of Kiel and the coast that had gathered into an alliance, was being beaten back by the League of the Ice Talons farther to the east. The king of the Ice Talons was a brutal old snowy, who really wanted dominion over the entire northern kingdom. It was at about that time that I was promoted to the most elite of the stealth force units. This unit, called Lasky, was in Liza's division, of which he was the commander-in-chief. I served him directly. Lies and his mate Lil made a beautiful couple in battle. It was as if they did not even have to speak. Their gizzards were so in tune, so harmonious, that they instantly knew what the other was thinking. Together they were a fearsome team. Their timing, their precision couldn't be matched. They were the anathema of the enemy. Everyone knew if the war was going to be won, it would be because of Lies and Lil. "So what happened?" Digger asked. "Was the war won?" Octavia sighed deeply and put down her duster. No. Ifgar became a Turnfeather, betrayed them, betrayed his brother, his family, the entire Keelian League. So jealous was he that, by this point, he went to the other side and swore he could break up the team. His only condition was that Lil be given to him as a mate. Oh no, all three owls said at once. I found out about the plan, but it was too late. They were already on the wing, set to attack a recon unit on an island in the Bay of Fangs. I usually flew aboard a heavy old barred owl. He was a terrific flyer, fast and silent, but he wasn't available. They got me a spotted owl instead, but she didn't have the speed. I got there just in time to see the ambush led by Ifgar. It was all going according to his evil plan, except for one thing. Lil was mortally wounded. Ifgar went berserk, and Lies went yeep. Yeep, Soren was stunned. When birds went yeep due to some enormous fright, some gizzard-chilling terror, their wings folded under, and they plummeted to earth. It was lucky that a bald eagle was flying over just then. The eagle took a plunge and caught Lies just before he would have hit the water, but he caught him by a talon, severely injuring it. Still, it would have been worse if he had fallen into the sea. He would have drowned. Owls can't swim worth rackdrops. The injured talon never healed properly. It was causing him a great deal of pain, so he finally bit it off himself. Bit off his own talon, Soren said in dismay. Believe me, after the first pain he began feeling much better. She stopped talking. Digger sensed that there was still more to tell. He stepped forward. Is there something else? Yes. It was in that battle, the Battle of the Ice Talons, it was later named, that I was blinded. I was so distracted by Lies going yeep that I didn't see the fierce old great grey owl coming up on the windward flank. I had coiled up to my tallest height and was frantically yelling at Lies to break the yeep spell. The great grey swept by and in 2 seconds plucked out my eyes. That was the end of my military career, and it turned out to be the end of Lies's as well. He never picked up a pair of battle claws again. She paused. Not to fight, at least. She nodded at the ones on the wall. Those old rusty ones are the ones he wore in that battle. I convinced him to retrieve them so they wouldn't fall into enemy talons. So what did you do? Well, Lies and I had become quite fond of each other by this time. He said that he was finished with war and had decided to retreat to a small island far from the Ice Claw Wars, which was in the Bitter Sea. There was a retreat there, an order of Gloxian brothers, who were devoted only to study. They had a great library, so that is where we went for a good long time. Nobody asked any questions. Lies read and read and read, and began his history, the one you saw in the history of the War of the Ice Claws. He also began his serious study of weather at the retreat. It was there I learned how to be a nest-made snake and tend to his hollow and the hollows of many of the other brothers. Where did Madame Plonk's sister come into all of this? Gylfie asked. Oh, a year or so before the great tragedy, she had left her family's hollow, desperate to escape because of her stepmother. Her life was utterly miserable. Music was not for her. There was something about her that Lies and his mate Lil took a fancy to. I think they liked her toughness, and she seemed extraordinarily skillful with her talents. So Lies gave her an introduction to the rogue smith on the island of Darkfall. When did you decide to come to the Great Tree? It was actually one of the Gloxian brothers' ideas. He felt that Lies had so much knowledge that it was a shame for it to be all locked up in a retreat. There were no young ones at the retreat. He felt that Lies could be a natural teacher. So he advised him to go to the Great Ghoul Tree, where there were always young owls to teach. And Lies said he would, but he would never ever train an owl to fight. He would never ever touch a pair of battle claws again. So he came here. I swear an oath of peace as well. Octavia paused for several long seconds. But now I think it is time to break it. I'll do anything to rescue my beloved master. Chapter 14. Eglintine's Dream. There was stunned silence when Octavia finished her extraordinary tale. It was almost too much to absorb. Soren, Digger, and Gylfie made their way back to their hollow. It was past first black, and Twilight and Eglantine had overslept. They were now just getting ready for evening chaw practice. "Where have you been?" Twilight asked suspiciously. "No time to explain now," Gylfie replied. "We'll tell you all about it later," Soren said, and turned to look at Eglantine. She looked a bit piqued. Her usual lustrous black eyes seemed dull. "You all right, Eglantine?" he asked. "I didn't sleep that well. Bad dreams, I think, but I can't remember them, really." The 5 owls left for their various classes. All the owls were required to attend all classes, even if they were not a member of that particular chaw. Tonight, however, they were all quite distracted in navigation. And in navigation, Soren nearly crashed into Primrose. "Soren, attention, please!" Strickstrom hooted. "Too much harvest celebration, I think." She made a clicking sound with her beak. In the dining hollow near dawn after classes ended, Soren, Gylfie, Digger, Twilight, Primrose, and Eglantine gathered at Mrs. P's table. "I'll stretch myself out longer," Miss Plithiver said, "if you'd like to invite some friends over." "Oh, that's all right, Miss Plithiver," Gylfie replied. "We're fine, just the 6 of us." But they weren't really fine. Gylfie, Soren, and Digger were very quiet. Eglantine was twitchy. Twilight sensed that he had missed out on something important, and so did Primrose, for that matter. Soren thought it might have been better if they had invited a few other owls over, even Odalissa. A non-stop talker like Odalissa would have made it easier. Their break light at this meal was, as this meal was often called, was delicious, with gahul nut porridge and milkberry syrup poured over it from the new harvest. Toasted mice and caterpillars dipped in a sweet juice made from the plump berries. No one, however, seemed especially hungry. In fact, they were ready to turn in by the time the first rays of the sun slid over the horizon. But first, of course, they had to go and bury pellets for Dewlap. There was only one more day, and then they would have completed their flint mop. It couldn't come quickly enough. Soon they were all asleep in the hollow, but Soren, even in his sleep, could sense his sister's restlessness as she fluttered in some storm-tossed sea of dreams. Then, toward noon, when the sun was reaching its highest point, a terrible shrill scream split the air of the hollow. A small tornado of downy feathers swirled up from the dreaming Eglantine. Soren was immediately by her side. "It's just a bad dream, Eglantine. A bad dream. You're here at the tree, safe in the hollow with me and Twilight and Digger and Gylfie. You're perfectly safe." Eglantine put her talons out to touch Soren, as if to make sure he was real, and that this was not a dream. "Soren," she spoke in a quavering voice, "I knew those stone walls that you described, where the roguesmith had her forge, reminded me of something." "Yes," Soren said slowly. "Remember the isinglass that when Trader Mags came last summer? When I saw that, it reminded me of something, too. It was after that I came out of my condition," Gylfie added slowly. "Yes, Gylfie, it was after that I recognized Soren again. Well, in this dream I dreamed of stone, and it has helped me remember more." "Remember what?" Soren said in a whisper. All the owls waited tensely. "I know where they kept us now, kept all of us from the great downing." Where? Soren was now in a fever. For months, Bourne and Baron had tried to figure out the mystery of the great downing. Where had the owls been before? Why they had been dropped in an open field far from any hollows or nests? The owls themselves were so confused and stunned they could give no clues as to the answers to any of their questions. In fact, for the first several days, the only words they uttered in their strange little sing-songy voices were weird chants about the purity of Tytos. The owls rescued in the Great Downing had all been some sort of barn owl, and the formal name for the family of barn owls was Tytonundi, or Tytos for short. Even when they finally were arrested and brought back to health, not one of them could recall what had happened to them. Eglantine opened her beak slightly as if she were about to speak, then shut her eyes tightly. There was a long pause. You see, it comes in patches. When I saw that thin silver sliver of colored stone last summer, the insink glass, and the moonlight through it, I heard the harp tuning up. I remembered how much they hated music. They? Who's they? Twilight leaned forward, towering over Eglantine. Well, they were barn owls, like us, for the most part. Some cities and some grass owls, a few masked ones. Yes, Soren said it slowly. Now try and tell us more, Eglantine. Well, they hated music. Music was forbidden. Why was that? I'm not sure, but for some reason we all craved music. They said we weren't working out. What did they mean by that? Gylfi asked. I don't know. Eglantine cocked her head quickly in one direction, and then the other, in the way young owls often did when they were confused or disturbed. Do you remember anything about the place you were in, or how you got there? Soren pressed. Not really. Was it a forest? Digger asked. No. Was it a deep stone pit? Said Gylfi, remembering the bleak stone prison of St. Aggie's that spread itself through rock gulches and canyons with nary a tree or a blade of grass. There was stone. Most definitely there was stone, like the stones of the roguesmith's forge in Silvervale, all carefully carved and stacked into walls. Eglantine blinked and blinked again, as if trying to see an image dim and faded and steeped in shadows. Soren suddenly had an idea. Last summer, Eglantine had started to shake, to have her fit, and then she remembered who she was when she had seen that fragment of the isinglass on Trader Mags's cloth. Just seeing the sliver of isinglass had jolted her out of her stunned state, and then all the owls from the Downing started clamoring to hear the music, for indeed Madame Planck had just started harp practice. The owls of the Great Downing had been frantic to get to the music, and it did seem to restore them. Gylfi, Soren turned to the little elf owl. Don't you have some isinglass from Trader Mag's? Yes, I was going to string it into a whirly glass, but I haven't had the time. It's almost all strung, but just not hung together yet. May I have a piece for a minute? Soren asked. Certainly, Gylfi replied. Just as Soren was picking up a string with sparkling pieces of the mica stone, the noonday sun flared into the hollow. Eglantine turned and gasped, and her eyes fastened on the bits of glass that Soren held. Slowly, the color spots of light dappled the air, and the dancing colors spread across her brother's pure white face. You look just like the stained glass windows in a castle, Eglantine said, softly. A castle, the other 4 owls exclaimed. Yes, Eglantine said. When we first got there, we thought it was so beautiful, even though it was in ruins, with many of the walls down and just parts of others standing. But we soon learned, Eglantine was talking now in a dreamy voice, as if she were in some kind of trance. It was beautiful, but there was ugliness, too. They called themselves the Pure Ones. At first they seemed kind. They wanted to teach us to worship Tytos, because they said we were the purest of the pure of all owls, and that is why we spoke the praising songs. But it wasn't at all the way that Mum and Dad used to read to us, Soren. No, not at all. I mean, you remember how Mum would try to hum a little tune and almost sing? We could not do that. They wanted nothing to do with music. They thought music was like poison. It reminded Soren of St. Aggie's, where questions were thought to be poison, and the worst punishments were reserved for those who asked the questions. But it was the one they called the High Tyto, Eglantine continued. He was the worst. He never said much, but he was so frightening. He wore a kind of mask, and they said his beak had been torn off in a battle. Then Eglantine realized that she had just said what she had just said, and fell into a faint. Metalbeak, they all whispered in terror. Gylfi immediately began flying over Eglantine, wafting draughts of air down upon her face to revive her. Twilight also tried, but his wings churned the air so violently that Eglantine was practically lifted off the floor of the hollow. Eglantine's eyes blinked open. My goodness, I fainted, didn't I? Then she looked up at Soren as she staggered to her feet. Take it easy now, little one, Twilight said. You've just had a bad fright. No, I'm fine. I'm really fine. I feel so much better. I just imagine I came face to face with Metalbeak. It's all coming back to me now. He was the one who hated music the most. He thought it was impure. In fact, he thought any owl who was not a Tyto alba was a little less than completely pure. He made the sooties and the masked owls and the grass owls do all the worst jobs. Oh, and yes, before we could become true members of the Way of Purity, we had to sleep in stone crypts with the bones of old Tytos that they called the purest ones. The purest ones, Soren said, perplexed. Gylfi had remained very quiet, but when she heard about the little owls being put in the stone crypts, she began to speak. I think that they did to Eglantine with stone what the owls of St. Agnes did to us with the full moon. Gylfi was referring to the horrendous moon-blinking process, during which the young owlets at St. Agnes were forced to sleep with their heads directly exposed to the scalding light of the moon. It disturbed their gizzards in a profound way and seemed to destroy their will, along with any of the individual characteristics that made up an owl's personality. Gylfi continued, only, instead of being moon-blinked, they were stone-stunned. I think I've heard of it. In the desert of Kunir, there are a series of deep, blind canyons, a maze really, and if one gets lost in them, the stone can affect the brain. If the owls come back, they are a bit odd, weird in the head. There was something else that Gylfi felt in her gizzard, but did not mention. She was almost sure that the bones in those crypts were not the bones of owls, but of the others. The thought, however, was too chilling, too sickeningly terrifying to even mention. Soren's eyes fastened on Eglantine's wing, where she had suffered her most severe wound from the great downing. The feathers had grown back, but patchedly. He felt swollen with anger at this vile owl Meadowbeak. I can't believe how he hurt you, Eglantine. It makes me want to kill him. No wonder Mum's and Dad's screams warned me. But you don't understand, Soren. It wasn't the Tyto owls of the castle that did this to my wing. Well, they did plenty. Feelings in my gizzard are really coming back now. But it was the other owls, the ones who raided the castle and snatched us. That is really how I and all the rest of us got hurt. They nearly got away with us, but the owls from the castle, the High Tyto and the Pure Ones, followed. There was this huge battle as they tried to snatch us back, and I dropped. So did a lot of us, because something came along and scared them all. I was surprised that I survived the fall, but then I was worried that I would be snatched again. That is why I dragged myself to hide under that bush where Digger and Twilight found me. Were they owls who snatched you barn owls as well? Gylfi asked. Oh, no, all sorts. There was a raggedy-looking great horned. She had a huge bare patch on her wing that made her fly all funny. Skench! Gylfi and Soren both blurted out at once. Skench, whose cruelty knew no bounds, the Alba General of St. Agulus Academy for Orphaned Owls, had just set such a patch on her wing. So they were from St. Aggies, Soren said. It all come back so clearly to Eglantine that now she could hardly stop talking. But meanwhile, one thought prevailed in Soren's mind. Were they actually any closer to finding Iselrai? Could Eglantine remember where this castle was, with its odd rituals that celebrated the purity of barn owls in such an awful way? Was Iselrai there, or had he simply gotten lost? Had he been stone-stunned, or was he dead? Chapter 15. The Chaw of Chaws. In times of trouble, however, there can come a certain closeness, a kind of coziness of spirit. It was never so true as in the hollow of Soren and his mates, Gylfi, Twilight, Digger, and now Eglantine. The stories that Eglantine told had a peculiar fascination for the owls in the hollow. Finally, it was Digger who asked, Eglantine, could you remember what the ground was like around the castle? I mean, was it like Silverville or the Beaks? I've never been to the Beaks, but how do you mean, Digger? Well, were there all tall trees, or was it scrubby with short bushy plants? Was it hard-packed earth, bare, or maybe sandy like a desert? Oh, none of those, I think. I can't remember exactly, for they hardly ever let us out. Although from the broken walls I could catch a glimpse. They didn't permit us to fly up high. I think there was grass, though, and they used to speak of a meadow, but I don't think there were big trees, or trees with leaves, because I can remember when I was just hatched, the hollow in our fir tree, Remember, Soren, how you could hear the wind through the leaves of the nearby trees? No, we only heard the wind whistling around the stone corners of the castle. Well, that's helpful, Digger said thoughtfully. Why? Asked Gylfie. I was just thinking, that's all. There was a tense silence in the hollow, but Soren was thinking too. Of course, Digger would be interested in the ground. Digger knew the ground, what kind of plants grew there, the feeling of every kind of soil. He had become one of the best in the tracking chaw. In fact, when Soren gazed around, he realized that within this hollow were the best of each chaw. Eglantine, Soren asked, do you remember how long you had been flying before you were dropped? Not long, I think. There was another pause. Eglantine, do you think that there is any way you might be able to lead us back to the castle? You see, I'm thinking that it's been more than 2 months since Easelribe disappeared. Endless search parties have been sent out, but so far nothing. In fact, Boren just assumed that was what we were doing when we went to Silvervale. Indirectly it was, but really we went to find out more about Metalbeak. Now, what's to stop us from trying to find Easelribe? Between us, Soren stopped and looked around. We could put together a pretty good chaw. What are you talking about, Soren? Gylfie asked. Gylfie, you are the best navigator Strixstrom has ever taught. I heard her telling that to Baron. Digger, you can track like no one else. And Twilight, you can fight, Soren's voice dropped off, if that's necessary. Twilight swelled in anticipation. Don't you see, Soren continued, we have the makings here of a great chaw, the best of the best of the chaws. Let me get this straight, Gylfie said. The little elf owl stepped right up to Soren and stood directly under his beak. Are you proposing that we should undertake this search for Easelribe on our own? No ribes, no grown-up owls. That's exactly what he's proposing, Gylfie, Twilight boomed. For Glox's sake, we went to Silvervale on our own, found the roguesmith. She gave us our first real clue, in a sense, about Metalbeak. Twilight paused and nodded deferentially to Soren. Well, after the scrooms of your mum and dad, that is. Well, if that's the case, Gylfie's voice fell to a whisper. Soren was nervous. If he didn't have Gylfie's support, he couldn't do it. If that's the case, Soren, you must be our leader. All the owls in the hollow nodded their heads in agreement. Soren was stunned. He didn't know what to say. Finally, he spoke. I thought the plan up, that's true, but the plan would be nothing without each of you. Your faith in me has stirred my gizzard. I shall do my best for you. Soren, Odalissa suddenly flew into the hollow. I want to come too. The meddlesome spotted owl had been perched on a branch just outside the hollow. Odalissa's yellow eyes were dim with tears. Easelribe made me believe in myself, and not just my... It was the first time Odalissa had ever been at a loss for words. You know how I was before I joined the Chaw. Easelribe made me believe I could do things because I was just me, and not just because I was a spotted owl. I hate that thing that you were talking about before. What thing? Soren asked. That stuff about purity. That one kind of owl is more pure or better than another. The most ancient order of owls, the owls that all of us are descended from, whether we are barn owls, snowy, spotted, or whatever, those first owls were called Glocks, and every owl celebrates the spirit of Glocks. My mum told me that, and it is true, for indeed with that ancient order began a special kind of bird. As owls, we owe our uniqueness, our ability to fly silently, to see through the darkness of the night, to spin our heads almost all the way around to those first owls. And you know from navigation that we call our grandest constellation that shines through every season the great Glocks. But for those owls that Eglantine talked about, that was not enough. They want to destroy all the others. They were all dismayed by Odalissa's gracious speech. Soren thought that she must have been eavesdropping more than once to have learned all of this. She almost started to blubber now with tears and chokes. It was the most un-Odalissa moment any of them had ever witnessed. I feel so strongly about this. You know me, I'm not an emotional kind of bird. But this, I can't explain. But you must let me be part of this. Of course, Soren said. Odalissa was very smart, and beyond being smart, she, of all of them, possessed the most sensitivity to atmospheric pressure changes. She had proved herself invaluable to the Weather Chaw. And this would be the best of the Chaws. Indeed, it would be the Chaw of Chaws. Chapter 16. The Empty Shrine. They had picked an evening to leave when there were no classes and no chaw practices, but still they were careful to leave the tree in 2s or 3s near first black, and then once again take off from the cliffs where they would not be spotted, and they all, even the smallest, wore battle claws. They had filched them from the armory and the forge. Bubbo happened to be gone, so it was not a problem. Twilight had gone early in the morning of their flight, and taken them from the forge, and placed them in the crags of the cliffs. Soren had insisted that they practice with the claws, for none of them had flown that often with them. Eglantine had never flown clawed, as the expression went. "You need a lot of tail ruddering, Eglantine, so you don't have the same balance as before," Soren called out as he watched his sister fly in a wobbly line out from the cliffs. "She'll get it," Twilight said, but Soren wasn't sure. Eglantine still seemed so fragile to him. Was she ready for this? She was the only one who would be able to recognize the ruined castle where she had been imprisoned. But then suddenly her flight seemed to even out. That's it! Soren cheered her on, her wings set and balanced on a smooth horizontal plane. Phew, Soren blew through his beak in relief. Still, it disturbed him that he was in fact doing just the opposite of what Iselribe had sworn never to do again. Soren was not only picking up battle claws, but arming a young, innocent owl with them as well. Then he thought of Octavia, and the words she had spoken to them in the very chamber where Iselribe's old claws hung rusted but not forgotten. "I swore an oath of peace as well, but now I think it is time to break it. I'll do anything to rescue my beloved master." The time had come, Soren realized. If there was any chance of rescuing Iselribe, they must do it now before winter set in. There was no choice. The first blizzard could happen any day now, and by then it might be too late. Soren ordered Eglantine back to the cliff. Then he stood before the chaw and spoke in a quiet but strong voice, and that did not waver as he gave the order. "Flight positions. Get ready to fly. Lift." The 6 owls rose into the night. The plan was to first fly back to the place where Eglantine had been found in the forest kingdom of Umballa. They would then somehow try, with Eglantine's help, to find their way to the castle ruins, and hopefully to Iselribe. As they flew, Soren wondered that if they were successful in reaching the castle, and if Iselribe was there, how would they actually rescue him? Perhaps he shouldn't think so far in advance. When they got there, maybe a plan would come to him. The first task was to get there, to this awful place where the young owls were forced to sleep in crypts with bones of these so-called purest ones, whatever that really meant. Twilight was flying point at the moment, and Digger flying below, for they were the ones who knew the territory where Eglantine had been found. We're in Umballa, and approaching the area of the Great Downing," Twilight called down to Digger. Digger immediately went into a ground dive. Gylfi began to hover over him. Twilight turned to Soren and nodded. This was the place Soren looked up and found the star that never moves. "Gylfi, take a sighting of our position between Never Moves and the first head star of the Great Glocks constellation." When Gylfi had their position fixed, they all began to spiral down, except Twilight. Twilight continued to hover above, alert for any other owls in the region. Then, with Digger and the others, they would try to work backwards from the spot where Eglantine had been found and reconstruct a path to the castle ruins. They lighted down in the dry creek bed. "Well, the tracks are gone, but by now, as I expected," Digger said. "But I do remember where I first picked them up." "Let's start with the actual bush where you found her first, Digger." With long strides, the burrowing owl was there in no time. The others followed. "Oh my," said Eglantine. "This is surely the place. I wouldn't forget it. Seems as if I spent forever here." "Now, Eglantine," Digger said, "fly along this creek bed and try to remember where you were dropped." They had flown less than a minute. "Do you think it was here?" Digger asked, for this was where he had picked up her tracks. "No, I think it was farther. It was pretty wet." They flew a few more minutes. Here, Eglantine suddenly said. She lighted down. There was a very small, gurgling stream of water, no more than a few inches deep. "I remember that rock." She lifted a talon and pointed. "I remember thinking, lucky I didn't fall on that." "Good," Soren said. Prepare to fly. We'll make at least 3 circles overhead. Eglantine, you try and sense which direction you came from. Oh, I don't know, Soren. That's going to be hard. I was so scared and there was so much commotion. I mean, it was a battle up there. Just do your best, Egg. That's all you can do. If we have to, we'll fly out in every direction from this spot. Gylfi, you're a navigator, so keep track of our position. Eglantine couldn't remember, and they did begin the slow process of flying out in all directions. The night is not simply black to an owl. There are layers of blackness of different densities. Sometimes the black is thick, a gooey black unleavened by starlight or the moon, and sometimes the black is thin, still black but an almost transparent sort of blackness. It all has to do with the shine and the set of the moon above, of the constellations rising or vanishing, and the features of the earth below. Whether the land is clad in a forest or barren and hard with rock, just as Twilight was an expert at seeing through the very deceptive grays of twilight and dawn, so Soren was skillful in reading the black of the full night. Thin to coarse black, he called out as they flew over a sparsely wooded area. Then half an hour later they flew in another direction, water black turning to crunchy. No, said Eglantine. I know that we never flew over water. The owls banked steeply and went back to their starting positions. As they settled down on the limbs of a tree, Gylfi suddenly had a brilliant thought. If these owls just wanted barn owls, and mostly Tyto albas, at that, doesn't it make sense that their castle might be located in either Tyto or very near one of its borders? More specifically, the boundary it shares with Umbala, which is very small. So they headed in the direction of the Umbala-Tyto boundary. Soren asked Odalissa to fly out as scout. It was not long before she came back with the report of a meadow. Upwind and to the west, but I spotted a forest fire just a little bit north of west. I would say 2 points off the second head star of the Great Glocks. I don't think we need to worry with the wind in this direction. Good work, Odalissa, Soren said. Soon the walls of the castle ruins rose in the dawn mist. Only one tower had remained completely. The rest had crumbled down, so they only stood slightly higher than the castle walls. A peaceful haze rolled over the meadow below. We'd better fetch up in that small grove of trees, Soren said. I have a feeling there might be crows around. From their perches in an alder, the 6 owls had a good view of the castle. It must have been lovely in its time, Soren imagined, and even if in its ruined state, 2 stained glass windows could be seen in the still-standing east wall. An embroidery of ivory and moss crept over the stone. It seems different, Eglantine said after several minutes. How? Asked Soren. Well, it seems very still, but it's almost full morning. They are probably asleep. I know, but a full morning, the guard usually changes. That's why I said we had to get here just before dawn, exactly at Twix time. The tower has no view toward the east, and at Twix time the guard changes, so we are really safe. But I would be able to see the changing of the guard, for the old guard usually circles the towers one time upon leaving. I haven't seen any owls circling, said Twilight. And the hunters usually went out to catch a few meadow voles. It's a good time just after Twix time for catching them, Eglantine added. They waited a good while longer. Finally Eglantine sighed. I think something is very odd. It is just too still. Look, see the deer going up to the east wall? That would never happen if the owls were there. But I wouldn't want to be wrong. I wouldn't want us to go in there and then be attacked. Soren had been thinking the same thing. He had an idea. Gylfi, do you think you could fly through that meadow grass without getting tangled up and have a closer look? She gave him a shocked look. Of course, Soren. Look, Soren, with all due respect, I might be a noisy flyer compared to some, but I can't thread my way through that grass like a nestmaid through a harp string. Elf and pygmy owls, although quite small, were considered noisy flyers for their lack of soft fringed feathers, known as plummels, that swallowed the sound of their wings pressing through the air. Good, I was never doubting your abilities, really. Now why don't you go up and take a look, but be careful. Come back at the first sign of any danger. Gylfi was off before they could wish her well. Great glocks, Odalissa sighed. Look at her go. She might be noisy, but look, the grass is hardly moving where she flies through. Gylfi was back in less than a quarter of an hour. It's empty. Completely empty. No sign, I take it, of Iselrib? Soren asked. Not that I could see. Well, we better have a look for ourselves, then. Soren paused a moment and gazed toward the castle. All right, we'd all better go together in a tight formation in case of crows. At the first sign of crows, we'll all pack in tight. There are 6 of us. I can't believe they'd mob us. A thrush whistled softly in a gallery as the owls lighted down within the cool shadows of the highest wall of the castle ruins. There were things in this place that Soren had never seen before. Things that were not of the forest, or the meadows, or the deserts, or the canyons. An immense, gilded, but rotting thing that Eglantine called a throne, where she had said the high Tyto perched. There were stumps of broken stone columns with grooves carved in them. What's that? Asked Soren, pointing with his talon to a high stone perch with stone ledges leading up to it. Well, said Eglantine hesitantly, it was from there that the High Tyto often spoke to us when he was not perched on the throne. The High Tyto, Soren asked. You mean Metalbeak? Yes, sometimes they called him his pureness, but never Metalbeak. Great clocks, it makes me want to yarp, Twilight snarled. This purity stuff sounds deadly. Soren thought that perhaps Twilight didn't realize how true his words really were. But I know no one is here, Eglantine continued, because of that thrush in the gallery. No one was ever allowed up there. Eglantine stood quietly peering one way and then the other. It was hard for her to believe that she was back here, but back now with her dear brother, which was even stranger. She sometimes wondered about Clud, but she had a bad feeling about him. She had a feeling that he might have something to do with her fall, or as he had with Soren's. She was never absolutely sure. By the time she fell, he was flying about all over, even when he was supposed to be in the nest with her when their parents were out hunting. He made her swear that she would never tell that he'd left her. One night he came back with blood all over him. She had no idea where he had been, but when their parents came back he told a lie. He said that a fox had been scuttling around at the bottom of the fir tree, and he thought he could get it. Their father was furious. Could have gotten yourself killed, Clud. Well, it was just a small fox. I wanted to do something nice for you and Mom. It was a complete lie. What's this? Gylfi said. She was perched in a wooden niche. Eglantine gulped. The shrine. That's what they called it, but it's empty. Gylfi cocked her head to one side, then the other. Then she flipped it back, so her beak almost touched the feathers between her shoulders. It sure is. And they're gone. What's gone? Soren asked. It was clear that Eglantine was very agitated. The sacred flecks of the shrine most pure. Flecks! Soren and Gylfi gasped in horror. Flecks, like the ones at St. Aggie's. Chapter 17. A Muddled Owl. In a large spruce tree, the old whiskered screech owl wrapped his 7 talons tightly around a slender branch. His head was so muddled, it was all he could do to concentrate enough to stay on the limb. He was completely disoriented, and had been since he had flown across the small river at the edge of the kingdom of Tyto. He could have sworn he was flying north, but then none of the stars seemed to line up properly. The golden talons, so beautiful this time of year, appeared to him upside down in the sky. And when he thought he was banking for an easterly turn, instead of flying into the glimmer of a rising dawn, he was flying into the darkness of the west. He had known he might be going yoicks when for a trace of a second he thought, well, maybe the sun does rise in the west. And then he realized he had been flying around in circles for days. Finally, exhausted, he had settled on the branch of a spruce, so confused he could hardly hunt. Luckily, the food supply seemed plentiful, or he would have starved. But summer had passed into autumn, and soon autumn would be chased away by the first bitter winds of winter. He would starve, he supposed. One could never plan these things, he thought. He had always imagined he would get snuffed into a hurricane's eye and spin around until he died, or be sucked up by a rogue tornado wind, the kind they called a torque demon, that tore across the landscape and could pull up not just one tree or 2, but an entire forest. There was even a story that one torque demon had sucked up a raging forest fire and dumped it on another forest, igniting it as well. Iselribe snorted. A fitting end for an old weathered owl like me. Every day, and he was not even sure how many days had passed now, But with each day he grew more and more confused. Soon he imagined he would be too confused to even hunt in the very small area that he was able to manage now. So this was what it had all come to. This was to be his death. It shivered as a cool autumn breeze, with more than one hint of winter in it, ruffled his feathers. He tried to be philosophical about it. He had indeed led a grand life, full of adventure, books, and young owls to teach. Scholar, sports owl, lover of a dirty joke or two. There had been danger, yes, and heartbreak. He closed his eyes, and a tear squeezed out as he thought of his dear Lil. But he had tried to serve well. He hoped nobly. Now, he thought, in the deep winter of my life, I am on the brink of another winter, my last. Islarab tried to imagine what he would miss the most, perhaps the peace of the dawn, the moment of twixt time that hung like a sparkling jewel between the grey of the night and the pink of a new morning. The young'uns, yes, undoubtedly, the young owls whom, throughout the years, he had brought into his chaw and taught to be fair navigators through any weather. Weather, he did like weather. He supposed that was what he did not like about this particular end. It wasn't a torque demon, and it wasn't the eye of a hurricane. It was, in fact, rather humiliating to die teetering and confused in a forest that he had thought he knew so very well. And I think that's where we're going to end for the night. I hope everyone enjoyed listening, and I hope you have a good evening and a good night. Till next time, my friends.